This episode is brought to you by our presenting sponsor, Pizant Building Products. Pizant Building Products has been providing contractors and builders with the supplies necessary to complete their jobs since 1964. They have built a reputation of honest, helpful, and quality service, serving the HRM for the last 58 years, now with 7 locations in Nova Scotia and 1 in New Brunswick. Our team at Atlantic Construction Podcast is extremely excited to announce our new co-branded partner, Procore. Procore is the global leader in construction management software. We'll be conducting several podcast episodes with Procore users and construction companies across the country in 2023, among many other things. Stay tuned. We're excited. Okay, welcome back to the Atlantic Construction Podcast. Today we're excited to have a panel discussion on all things net zero. And we've got a lot of different perspectives in the room today. So I'll start by introducing to my left, the far left, William Marshall with LMMW Group. We have Murray Tate with Tate Engineering and Airtight Spaces. To my right, we have Keith Robertson, president at Solterre Design. And to the far right, we have Lara Ryan, Lara Ryan Consulting and BuildGreen Atlantic. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Excited to have a conversation on net zero.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Laura, maybe we can start just a little bit of info on BuildGreen Atlantic, which is next Thursday, March 30th at the Nova Center. I know you've been working really hard on that event, and it sounds like there's been a lot of great response this year.
Yeah, really excited about BuildGreen Atlantic. We've been away for 3.5 years, so it's nice to come back. The event's sold out with 370 delegates.
Wow.
49 trade show booths. It's a really good opportunity to bring the building industry together, and I think part of the reason there's so much enthusiasm is that the building industry is so varied. You know, it's from the design professionals to the tradespeople and everybody in between, building owners and policymakers. So it's going to be a great event. We did open up the trade show for a free trade show pass between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. So if you go to buildgreenatlantic.ca, you can register for that trade show pass. So if you missed out on the full conference, you can at least still come and visit the 49 booths.
Yeah, that's great. No, it's exciting, and I know our team's excited to be there, and I'm sure
we certainly are.
These gentlemen will also be present. So
absolutely,
everybody who's anybody will be there.
There we go. So today, lots to discuss on the topic of net zero, not an unfamiliar term, but maybe not so well defined. It's hard to know where to start, but Murray, maybe you could kick us off. I know we were talking before the episode. You know, it's a simple process, but kind of full of blockages and so many layers with 5 steps to net zero.
Yeah, like technically, I think the people around this table understand that when I look at anything, I try to boil it down to the simplest steps. And what I've been taught by the likes of Natalie Leonard and people that are pioneers in the industry is super insulate, airtight, right size your window and doors, quality window and doors, right size your mechanical equipment, and then that minimal offset with renewables. So it was interesting when Roxanne and I started our business, we were looking for an opportunity, and I went to a trade show in Toronto, and these steps were in our mind, and we wanted to do something different, something for the future of our business and our legacy, I guess. And I came across Aero Barrier, and the gentleman I met, Gord Cook and his team, they had brought HRVs to Canada, and he said, do you want to get involved in something new? And when he described the system where you pressurize a space, atomize a sealant, and the sealant automatically goes to the holes, I said, that's step 2, done and delivered. And we were taking a lot of courses with the Chamber of Commerce at the time, Roxanne and I, and they were encouraging us to invest in the green economy. And so we did. We invested heavily. And here we are 4 years later, a pandemic in the middle of it. It's not something anybody can control, but it's difficult to swallow that, okay, Now that we've invested
in some of this testing gear.
in
and whatnot.
well in this sealant equipment
Yeah.
and to make the industry better, to make buildings better, to make them healthier. Now that we've done our investment, and you hear the government say, "Oh, we're going to net zero by this timeline and this timeline," and to see in 2020 they take it off the table in the National Energy Code and the National Building Code, it's like, okay, on one hand the government's saying invest, but then on the other hand they're not creating the demand.
Yeah.
And so we need the demand to drive the growth.
For sure.
So it's a little frustrating, actually can be quite a bit frustrating, and I think we'll get into that as we go. But so we're invested into airtight spaces, and I'm going to focus on that part. Our business does other things, but that's where I'm going to focus.
Mm-hmm.
Try to focus anyway. See what happens today.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a political issue, and there's so many other layers. And like you said, the government's not creating the demand while they're, have this incentive for more testing and then their waivers. I think it's almost a similar way with the building code, but no enforcement. Any comments on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of layers to that. I mean, there's always the political will component, right? You're going, what do we want? How do we get forward? We want to move these things, but then, we're going to be cautious because we need to keep hands on side and we need to keep the building officials up to speed. We can't ask them to go enforce something that they haven't been trained on. So there's always these, we'll say the train is, the head of the train's moving, but the midsection, the ass is still sitting in the station, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I think when you look at those bits, Murray's perfectly in the middle of something where he said, I've invested my money.
Yeah.
I'm going after a sector of this. And at the end of the day, you're going, well, we're stepping back from, we're saying we're leveraging and we're going full in. And then we go, well, maybe let's just look at it again. And I think, even something as simple as the actual definition of net zero is really that place to start. We're saying, throw these terms around, we're going net zero.
And you say there's 14 different definitions.
Yeah, so Keith and I did a presentation for Public Works, and that was their piece. They're going, educate us on what is net zero. And so Keith did some digging, and I think it was across North America, 14 definitions of net zero. And this is net zero energy we're speaking of, right? So when you look at that, there's no wonder that there's absolute confusion out there. And you have folks that are non-technical policy, you have folks that are, industry related, trying to keep people employed and go, we don't want to flip into something that actually puts us out of work or makes it so cost prohibitive to build these buildings. But at the same time we need to make changes. So that idea of first getting on the same page of what is net zero, what is the definition, what's the target, and what are we trying to actually accomplish together? Because like Murray says, there's a couple of slices to that cake, right? There's layers here that we have to do, and good design to the envelope is kind of that first step.
Right. It's the first step of a few steps. So for our listeners and for context, maybe we can start before we get too deep into the different layers of a sufficient definition of net zero. As far as ASHRAE, I think, Keith, you mentioned this to me, an energy efficient building on an annual basis produces as much energy as it consumes. Can we start there?
We can certainly start there, and that's a nice, clean, understandable definition. So first of all, being energy efficient, so as Murray says in the first two steps, and then getting that demand as low as possible, and that's really the object, and then using the remaining energy that you need, offsetting it, ideally on-site with renewables. So typically that's roof-mounted photovoltaics or that kind of strategy. So that's a nice clean definition. However, that's not a common understanding, and it's not always achievable. So you take a building like downtown Halifax or a 12-story apartment building, it's not going to have enough roof area to put enough renewables on it. So it has to be tweaked a little bit. But most of the simple definitions kind of follow that logic. An energy efficient building that offsets its energy use on an annual basis with renewables.
Yeah, and I think when we were talking earlier, the statement like finance trumps everything isn't just for private. Like this is something that you deal with publicly as well in public tenders, and it's a lot of the same problems there, even when the government has incentive.
You're touching a bit of a sore point, because if we all look at this here and we look at our wallets, half our money goes to tax dollars.
Yeah.
And if we can't get Public Works and different entities within the government to understand, you need to mix these bags of money of capital and operational and make decisions on total cost of building ownership. These are our tax dollars, every one of us. And so There's more money going into operation costs than there is into the building costs.
A lot
Yet-
more.
A lot more. Yet the decisions are made on balancing that capital budget.
And we're seeing some very real examples of that. So on one hand, we're seeing movement from the government with Bill 57 saying all new projects funded by the government need to be net zero or net zero ready and be climate resilient. And it comes back to this, what does that mean? What's the definition of it?
By 2050, right? Is that the...
No, by that go into that start the planning process after 2022. So that means buildings that we start planning now
Okay, right.
need to be net zero.
Or were you saying there's kind of like an overage, like on the timeline there, like 5-6 years of...
There's going to be certainly some lag in how you define when the project starts the planning stage, but we're certainly now in that window. But we've seen this language coming into RFPs, and an example would be a school that says, you know, that just went out for an RFP for design services in last year or a couple of years ago, acknowledging Bill 57, saying the project is to be net zero or net zero ready and climate resilient without defining that. We start into the design process, and the project managers will go, well, actually, we're not required to do that yet, and we do have this budget thing. So that's just
It's a budget thing. Yeah.
right.
There's that.
It very precisely fits into what Maria describes: is the province builds a school, the school board maintains and pays the operating cost of the school. So the province has their budget; they're not really worried about what the school board pays for the operations of it. So we've got to get into this notion that we look at the life cycle cost of the building and plan appropriately from day one.
And there's discrepancy there and a gap between the provincial government, municipality, the school board, just not all on the same page as far as...
It's just the way it's always been. And you can talk to people in public works and they go, yeah, I know, it doesn't make
It's kind of
sense, does it?
tradition
versus-
Oh, yes, you're right. It
There's
doesn't
a lot
make
of
sense, but-
tradition involved in this
There's a
whole
lot of
arena, too.
opportunity for leadership and sort of breaking away from this, but it's tough to be the first, whether it's the, you know, and it's not a problem unique to Nova Scotia. It's happening in other jurisdictions
It's tough to
as
be the
well.
first. That's the point, right?
But we're kind of running out of time. Like somebody's got to show leadership and just blast through this stuff. And even to the point of the definition of net zero, I think it goes back even a little bit more than that on sort of some baseline sustainability understandings of why you know, crazy people like us are pushing this stuff all the time and trying to make people change the way they do things, and a little bit of the sky is falling, hurry up, we've got to go, right? Like there's a bit of a sensitivity to that too, that is this really all necessary, and getting everybody on that same page from a climate and sustainability and
from of global warming standpoint, it's like, yes, we obviously need to make a shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That's
right.
kind of
and
generically well known. But
clear the path for those leaders to really emerge and say, we're going to do it no matter what. Halifax is a good example with the climate plan, right? Like they're getting a lot of pushback on Halifax, the climate plan, because it means that you have to raise people's taxes, and nobody wants that. But how are you going to do this unless we find mechanisms to pay for it? And so being able to keep pushing that through is a challenging place for leaders to be sometimes, you know, but we need more of them, and we need people to support that kind of leadership. And I think creating a better understanding of why and creating that demand is going to help some of the challenges that the industry faces.
Moving forward and adopting the first R, reduce, they're counterintuitive. That's what we find when we're having discussions with people, is that, oh, we want to advance. Well, everything that we've learned from advancing, I'm not, I'm middle age here, I guess. There's been more and more energy used. And if we want to keep advancing, people don't want to reduce. Why should I pay more tax, or why should I do this to reduce? Have less.
It's a good idea as long as it doesn't impact me.
Yeah.
Don't ask me to reduce what I already have. I think, but the key in a little bit of what Lara was saying, and then really where Keith started there with this idea of life cycle analysis, right? We are very blind to the fact of, and I'll use Walmart as an example, I can go in and I take it off the shelf and I just assume it's there, right? I don't care how it got there. I don't care where the materials came from and what factory they came to, and then what truck they were on or what boat, right? We take it, we go, it served my purpose, I'm done with it, right? So I have total ignorance of upfront and total ignorance of kind of once it's left my house, we'll say, right? And you look at taxes as a way people go, I don't want to pay taxes, and taxes are an easy thing to rail against because they're like, nobody likes paying taxes. I get that. The reality is that it's really more about the total cost of ownership. It's like, what's the true cost of that item? So if you had to say, when I bought that widget at Walmart, if I really knew it was $50 and not $12.99, would I buy it in the first place, right? It's that idea of going, some of these items we don't need. Some of the demand is artificially created. It's a consumer-based, consumer-driven society, right? So when you take that look with a building, and Murray nails it, when you're going, upfront budget and operating, they're not different. They're the same thing, right? And at the end of the day, when you put someone in a building and go, well, you've got, whether it be a LEED Gold, a zero carbon, a net zero energy, but they don't have enough money to pay the bills, regardless of, what the budget was to build it, it's just kind of backwards and nonsensical.
I don't see the media taking people into account on what the utility bills cost in an annual basis, but they certainly will take us to account when we need $5 million more to finish a school.
Yeah.
Right? And so it doesn't sell.
It's not just limited to, we've talked about governments, provincial and municipal levels. We see it in other sectors as well. We've all seen the number of cranes building apartment buildings around Halifax. Developer doesn't really need to worry about the cost of energy because the tenants are going to pay that one way or another, whether it's included in your rent or whether it's a separate utility. It's going to fall on the tenant. So that gives them the opportunity to say, let's just do the absolute minimum here. And there's some issues in the code here that we can probably get into that allow them to really minimize cost and do very little in terms of real energy reductions.
When decisions are being made on projects, the question gets asked, who's paying the utility bills?
Yeah.
When you're behind closed doors and people are asking, what decision are you making, sir, madam? Well, who's paying the bill? And then the decision gets made.
Yeah, and we can play the devil's advocate in lots of different ways here with different parties and different layers. As a developer, everything costs so much.
Yep.
If you're not forced to pay for something, you're not going to pay for it.
You're not going to do it.
There's ways, and that's understandable from their perspective in ways.
Well,
not to make them out to look like the bad guy.
And they're not.
Completely.
At the end of the day, they need to provide housing that's as affordable as they can make it.
Yeah.
And the consumer bears responsibility. People ask us, who's your number one competitor? And I say, the granite countertop guy down the road. And they look at me kind of strange. And I say, well, that's easy, because if there's an extra $3,000 to $4,000 to spend on a house, they're going to pick what they can feel and touch and understand. And what their friends come over and say, oh, that's a beautiful countertop. Right. Nobody's getting down on their hands and knees and saying, wow, that's really draft free around this plug. It's not happening.
Yeah.
Right? So
true. I mean, it's comical, but that's such a good analogy because, and again, it's money up front.
But
for long-term.
If we required some things like labeling, so if you think of what the Energuide label did to change the appliance industry, right? Like you wouldn't go out and buy a fridge now that didn't have an Energuide label on it. And if we had a requirement that people label their homes, they needed a label on it before you were able to sell your home, you bet people would be fixing the drafts. And
Ford puts a nice label on the car.
Yeah.
And I only spent $40,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
good analogy, right? Because people invest a lot in their cars and a lot in the longevity and life cycle.
And you stare at that list and you go 10 miles to the gallon or whatever the number is that you think is important. Horsepower or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
You look at it.
But the transition to that label, the process of transitioning everybody is big, right? Because so say we implement labeling. Well, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, it's just going to be a standard and then everybody would do it. But to get to that point where you've got the consumer tipping point is quite big and kind of scary for people, right? So I don't want to be the house that has the crappy efficiency, I want to sell my house. I don't want to put any barriers up. So there's a lot of resistance to that kind of idea. But if we started requiring it on new construction and then started requiring it on the sale of houses, eventually the building stock would have these labels. Right. And that would be something that could
I think
potentially
there's-
move the market.
I think there's time to build that into the industry as well. We can give them a bit of warning. You don't have
Yeah.
to do it tomorrow,
Right.
but starting in 2024 or whatever, or starting with single family homes and then multi-unit.
Right, or
So we
start
can-
with
we
an
can-
archetype
Yeah,
or something like that.
We can transition to
So
that.
I'm
in fact,
baffled. Where does the resistance come from on labeling houses when
Well-
there's such a big investment?
Exactly, but they're also it's not an easy fix necessarily, right? If you need to take your house from a terrible performing home to something that's even in the middle, not even efficient, but even in the middle, you could be looking at tens of thousands of dollars to do that work to your house, and that's a barrier for people. Even though I agree with you, it's a huge investment, and why wouldn't you want to do that? And why wouldn't you want to save on the operating? Like, we all know the business case is there. If you look at the total cost of ownership, or you look at the life cycle assessment, it's there. But if you're asking somebody to put $20 or $30 or $40,000 out of pocket to retrofit their home so that the label is palatable to somebody who's buying it, that's a barrier. And especially if we've created a mechanism to say it's palatable or not, right? So right now, people buy those homes all the time. They don't know the energy efficiency of the homes. It's just not part of the conversation. But if we're making it part of the conversation, then we're creating a bit of a challenge.
Could that be a good segue into enforcement? Like, if you're going to label something, then it has to be tested, it has to qualify.
Right.
Because a lot of times the issue, like, I think someone made the comment when we were discussing leading up to our panel here, that code is beyond what buildings are achieving. So a lot of times when it comes to air tightness, like, what percentage of homes in commercial buildings are meeting the actual code for air tightness?
The most interesting comment we get when we're doing our sales pitches, my building is tight enough. And when I hear that resistance, I just come back and I say, what have you tested lately? And when the silence hits, then the conversation gets really interesting.
Right.
Because performance-based codes are, I think it was you the other day, Will, that you talked about. Would you just give us a target?
Yeah.
We're professionals. We'll tell you how we're going to get there.
Right.
Would you just give us a target, a performance target, and let the professionals do their job? I don't think the government can hire enough enforcement. It's not possible. They can't go out and put blower doors on every unit. They can't do all the modeling.
It's super insulated, everything.
Visual inspection will only take you so far.
Correct.
And with the materials that are coming, and if we were to get this conversation into zero carbon, that's a whole other discussion. That's a panel for another day.
Yeah. With materials and how they're manufactured,
Yeah.
and logistics.
And the ways to insulate, and where's the dew point, and the building science behind all this.
Yeah.
Houses and apartment buildings and complexes that we design and build, you're going to have to rely on your architects and your engineers. It's just more complicated.
And I don't think we need to be blazing trails here. I think the City of Toronto is already saying
Right.
that you're going to have to start labeling houses in 2023. You're going to have to start putting or meet energy targets for apartment buildings and office buildings. And so I think there's a path forward that we can just say, this looks like a good idea.
Yeah.
Let's go there. Let's start doing it.
We have about 80 dealers in our network across North America. And every year we go to a conference in Ohio, and every year the gentleman from Vancouver is doing best in the league.
Yeah, you talked about PC and
because they have a step code.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
Tell us about the step code.
And so I don't know a lot about the step code, but generally speaking, every 3 to 5 years, they ratchet down the air tightness, they up the insulation values in a Part 9 building, and they make it simple. They boil it down to, this year you have to get 3 air changes and go to R24. In 5 years, just so you know, it's going to be R30, R50, and an air change of 1.5. I'm making up the numbers, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
In a Part 3 building, they rely on the energy modelers, and they say, you need to get to this. You're going to have to take over here, Will,
Sure.
but it's the energy demand.
Yeah, so when you look at these things, and this is where this idea of a benchmark makes a lot of sense, right? You go, I'm giving a budget, just like I would give my kids a budget, right? Or I'm a new student, I have a budget. This idea going, here's how much energy you have per square meter, per square foot. Work within the bucket, right? So a net zero ready, in theory, is 100 kilowatts or less, depending on where you define it. I think ASHRAE goes even further, 68-ish.
Can I get you to define net zero ready, just
Sure.
for listeners?
So
I know that's not an easy thing to do, but it might.
the intent of net zero ready is to go back to Murray's first analogy of going, we've got this pyramid or this cake where we go waste out first, high efficiency next, and then end of pipe solution, which is your solar on the rooftop. Net zero ready is intended to be efficient enough that I could put the panels on the roof, if that makes sense.
Right.
So it's like, I've done everything well. I've done the air sealing. I've got my thermally broken envelope. I've got my outside continuous insulation. I've got good glazing. It's sealed, it's tested. And now I've put in a high performance mechanical system. In theory, I'm as low as I can go without, pulling the trigger on the first panel, if that makes sense. And I see Keith as...
I thought you might ask that question. So actually, I was doing some research and I pulled out a couple. So the Halifax has their definition. So, and we'll go to the net zero. Let's see, net zero, and this is in the administrative order from Halifax, says net zero means that 100% of a building's energy need is generated on-site or off-site through a renewable source. I'm not sure what the off-site part is, whether the owner needs to own something or buy credits or whatever, but that's what it is. Notice they didn't say anything about energy efficiency in there. They just said offset your use. But a net zero ready, from the same document, net zero ready means reducing the building's energy consumption by 50% compared to the 2017 National Energy Code, and maximizing on-site renewable generation with the intention to purchase off-site renewables or carbon offsets as they become available. Another definition, I don't know if it's still in use or not, when the Canadian Home Builders Association had their net zero ready program, and their definition, I think, was you had to be net zero ready, you had to reduce by 75% compared to the current standard, and have enough roof area to offset the rest with photovoltaics, and have conduit or the infrastructure to be able to connect. So again, definitions are kind of here.
Yeah.
And
That seems to be a common
Halifax is
thing.
actually a shadow pilot for the Canadian Home Builders Association net zero pilots that they're running across the country.
Okay.
And part of the reason that Halifax isn't full in is because Halifax is already running a retrofit pilot. And had been sort of down the path. But they are collaborating with CHBA on the other pilots that are happening across the country. So everybody's trying to figure this out, right? Like everybody's trying to figure out what's the best pathway. And the good thing that I see is there's a lot of collaboration happening. Like nobody's holding this conversation
Secret sauce.
right? It's like, how do we do this? It's like you said, Toronto's already done it. BC's already done these. Like people are sharing solutions and sharing pathways, and there's going to be some regional disparity probably, but there doesn't have to be very much, right? And I see a real sense of or a real spirit of collaboration amongst stakeholders in the space these days, because it's a huge problem. It's like, this is a really, really big thing that we're trying to do to get to net zero for new construction by 2030 and all buildings by 2050, right? Like that's a really, really big thing. So instead of everybody battling with each other over who gets the business, everybody's kind of, I kind of see it as everybody going, there's going to be lots of business. How are we going to get there? And that's, so the ones that are a little further down the path, how did you get that far down the path? We need to figure out whether we take those steps that way or we take this step. Nobody's figured it out yet. Nobody's at 2050 yet. But,
And capacity is a huge issue.
Capacity is a huge issue.
Numbers off the top of my head, I think the city of Edmonton has targets for their own buildings to be net zero by 2030. And somebody actually went through and said, that means, okay, in the next 6 years, we have to do 500 buildings per year as net zero. And that's, how are we going to do that? Not the expertise, not the labor force.
So all new builds, or can they be retrofits?
No, that's the retrofit. So they're going to retrofit their building stock, and that means they'd have to retrofit 500 buildings per year.
Well, if you look at the Halifax plan for all buildings, it's 5,000 a year of homes that need to go through retrofits. So that's pretty significant. And to Murray's point about making the investment too, right now we've got a lot of companies that do insulation or that do heat pumps or that do windows, but there's not a lot of sort of one-stop shop for a homeowner who's going to do a deep energy retrofit, you know, to have one company come in, because they need the signals from the market that it's going to make sense for me to be a one-stop shop, and I'm going to buy this insulation guy, and I'm going to buy this window company, and I'm going to be the company that can go in and do that. And we know in jurisdictions where they've had really successful pilots of retrofit programs that the market has responded, and the market has seen the opportunity and said, okay, we'll do all of these things. It's like you and your new company will, right?
Yep.
We can do that. We can do that.
Yep.
Let's build what's needed. And we haven't really shown the market drivers here yet, because the demand from the homeowners aren't there. And we're also still relying on incentives, lots of carrots,
Right,
carrots,
where's the
right?
money?
To get people to do it. And a lot of people are going, yeah, where's my incentive? How much am I going to get if I go off oil? Like, people aren't saying, how much am I going to save over the next 10 years if I go off oil? They're saying, how much of a rebate am I going to get if I go off oil and install a heat pump? Who's going to pay for that for me? Instead of looking at the, you know, next 10 years of savings of the oil.
Yeah. Will, we went off on a big tangent there. Did you want to keep going with the thread that you were on there?
Oh,
'Cause I think
sorry.
you
No,
were-
no.
No,
I
no.
think that's exactly.
that was-
that's
What
exactly
thread was
where
that?
we're
Oh,
going.
we-
Yeah.
Which tangent
Yeah.
was that? I totally missed the
50
transition.
threads. I think the capacity one is a good
All
thread
right.
to kind of dial back in on, because again, you look at these numbers and the retrofit capacity. And Murray was talking before the session, going, you know, it's hard enough to get people to bid on stuff, you know, contractors and subs, and you're going, you know, when you look at that volume of work, and again, let's ignore brand new.
Yeah.
The volume of existing stock is massive, right? And so I'll use a good example. The feds put out the program for the green homes, right? And they're going, okay, we're going to spend this money. We're going to go out. We have auditors trained. They're going to come in and do the home audits. They're going to actually do blower door tests. They're going to give you your recommendations. We've got some rebates. There's a $40,000 zero interest grant. You can access it. That took a year and a half before they even were like, we think you can sign up for it now. But the reality is if you look at the actual stock across Canada, and it was Shauna Henderson that kind of gave me the stat, she's like, there's about 780 certified residential auditors. So for them to actually go through the stock, just on the numbers alone, they're doing 4 to 5 audits a day. That's not just show up at your house, take the measurements, do the blower tour test. That's model them, finish them, put the reports at the door. It's impossible, right? It's physically impossible. We don't have the users, let alone the end person to put it in play. And I think that, and not to crap on the older generation, sorry Keith, but the reality is that you have the way of business. It's the business as usual, right? So we've had clients that are turned off. You know, we had a multi-unit res client that was ready to go, heat pump. They're like, oh, I talked to my electrician. He said heat pumps don't save energy. It's like, they might not save electricity, no, but they definitely save energy. Do you know what I mean? So same thing, you know, we had our house retrofit. And to give you an example, it's a 2.5 story. It's an old 90-year, and we put 2 inches of foam and redid the whole thing. And we're going to spend about $70,000. So that's a big investment on top of owning a house. But the reality is, you'll talk to a contractor who goes, "Oh, I wouldn't do that." So, well, we can't tape the seams; it won't breathe. And you're going, so you're trying to make efficient moves, and then you're getting what I would call as business as usual, or the leftover notions of the way we've always done stuff, and it's not informed. Right, so for say Murray to come in, Murray knows that if he makes my house a 0.6 air change and I don't have mechanical ventilation, that is going to be a problem, right? But it's not about saying, you know, maybe Lara doesn't know anything about that. She just goes, I just want my bill to go down. I want to feel more comfortable. And you get the one builder that showed up to give you a price and he goes, oh, I wouldn't do that, right? And so we're continually fighting this, re-educate, re-inform, retrain. And at the end of the day, we still have this giant beast to kind of chew up piece by piece, and we're still talking about it.
I feel like, you know, there is a level of, I think the right term would be ignorance from, I'll give context, say like the 4 individuals, the 4 of you here are professionals in this space. And even then, it can be hard to define things and understand what certain terms mean or give context to it. So I think the further away from having it in your micro environment every day, the more room there is for everything to just be misunderstood, and not, like you're saying, a lot of contractors maybe just don't know,
Well, it's a risk,
what the
right?
terms mean, what
100%.
yeah, and maybe it's not with ill motives, just just ignorance.
Or
to
how
it.
to inform their clients as well,
Yeah.
right? If their client, they don't know, or they know a little bit about it, they've heard a little bit about it, but they don't feel confident enough to inform their clients. And where do you go to find that? Like that's you know, it's
Well, because
a thing,
then
for
the
sure.
problem needs to be solved even from the public sector with large projects and you know, professional corporate construction firms, all the way down to you know, my
Bob's
buddy
Hammers
Bob
in the
up
truck,
up yeah up
exactly.
building the home in Bedford or in Dartmouth or anywhere, and then you know, for him there's the same amount of resistance there. Like, I don't want to change the way I do things. I'm not sure what this whole net zero thing is about, and till
And I'm busy enough, and I'm getting paid,
and I'm busy and I've
you
got
know,
lots on my
yeah,
mind, and yeah.
yep.
I want to go back to the thread you were talking about on retrofit and education. In retrofits, it's generally known by the building science community that air tightness is the #1 target. You take care of air tightness first.
Regardless of renewables or your mechanical
Yep,
system.
take care of air tightness first because it reduces the demand on everything else. So when we're dealing with professional owners like public housing, you know, the Nova Scotia government, we have to educate them and talk to them about, well, you could manually seal, and when they do that, they go in and they caulk around the baseboard, and they can get about 20 to 30% of the air leakage out. We did a project for Lindsay's and Eastport Properties, and we took 90% of the leakage out with our system. But the one limitation to our system is we need to remove the contents from the space. You know, it would be one thing if there was somebody there, but their contents have to go. So that makes it unaffordable. So you have to plan it in such that, oh, when are you removing and changing the floors? What do you mean? What does energy efficiency have to do with floors? Well, when you're taking the floors out, the furniture's already out. And so when you're doing flooring retrofits, do your windows, and then the casing and the baseboard's all off, then you seal it. So they have to make the connection that, oh, when the floors come out, it's the right time to air seal it. And that's when you change your windows. And do those things at the same time. So these are the things we've learned over the past few years in retrofit cases. We have a lot of people who love the idea of the product, and then when it dawns on them that, you want all the contents out. And I say, yeah, no, thank you. I hear you. I understand that. So that's part of the education to get the air sealing on the way we do it.
Well, and I think the time to do retrofits is also when residential, we'll use that as an example, transition. So somebody's selling and somebody's buying, you know, but in a perfect world, that doesn't happen all the time. But wouldn't that be great?
Yep.
That we've identified all the things that need to happen to this house. It's empty. It's, you know, the bank's going to finance it because it makes a whole lot of sense. And they say, yeah, you can add $40,000 to your mortgage, no problem, because you're going to save all of this energy costs. You can just apply that to the loan, and we think you should go ahead and do that. And
We've often thought we should be giving lunch and learns to the Realtor Association.
you should,
Yep.
actually. Yeah, it's absolutely, you should. And it's the same issue with, you know, that I was talking about earlier with the labeling. You know, that all needs to happen on those transition
What do you
times.
reach the building asset owners, like through BOMA and those kind of things as well for education? Or
In the past 2 years, we haven't been able to reach anybody. Thanks for having us here, because
Yeah.
that's
why we're here, though, right?
That's one of the
That's
frustrating parts is that we
Yeah.
invested a year ahead of
right.
COVID, and then it was like shut the doors. And we've had a lot of great people with purchase orders ready to go, and then the price of plywood went like this.
Four
And
times the size.
Yeah, and those same folks would call us and say, Murray, you understand why we have to pull your PO. It's not a code requirement. Yes, I understand. And you walk away. What can you say to them? They can't afford to put the building up because they budgeted the year before, and that's a known thing to us. You mentioned about carrots on incentives,
Oh, yeah.
right? I wonder if the biggest carrot would be, I can make an extra $30,000 because my label scores higher than the next guy.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely an incentive.
But
Just
hasn't
nobody
there-
knows about it. Nobody's using it.
Hasn't there
right?
been some cases locally here? I don't know if we can name the developer or the project. Maybe we can. Maybe it's okay. Will, I know you mentioned one where, you know, the building was built. We had a developer involved locally in the city who was kind of a front runner and a leader as far as net zero, going above and beyond. 75% more efficient, but then the incentives, it was built too well almost.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you'd be more than happy to have us name him. His name's Peter Polycorp, and they're not the biggest builder, but his model is I'm going to keep these buildings for the long haul. Comfort's important. Being able to stabilize the rent, knowing that the rent also includes operating costs, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, he's gone out and done stuff that's well beyond code. And then he gets to the point where he's going, I've got some stock that's older, but was when it was built was 75% better than code. This is the Woodman's Grove in Wolfville. And he went to get refinanced through all this new funding that's available. And they go, okay, you need to be 25% better than your existing operating bills. He goes, here they are. Obviously, they're very low because guess what? I already did the work up front. I got rid of the waste. I downsized my mechanicals. And now we're having this debate of going, well, it's not really saving you if you're putting solar on. You're going, well, I can't buy anything more efficient than the geothermal that's running or the air-to-water heat pump. And so you've got these leaders out there that are kind of blazing the way, willing to show folks how it's done, working inside a regular construction budget. Maybe he takes a little bit longer. He does a bit more shopping, you know what I mean? But and then there's a guy there that's getting de-incentivized because now he can't get access to funds that the folks that are coming in under that program and building just over code are getting access to.
You might have had more to say, Murray. I might have.
Well, no, he's talking about leaders, and
Yeah.
I can't help but
About
think.
the incentives. Yeah.
No, I was thinking about a post I seen on LinkedIn this winter, and I think it was Eastport Properties did a test on their building because we haven't talked about resiliency yet. We've been talking about energy efficiency.
What is that anyway?
And so they took a warehouse of theirs in Burnside, I understand, during that cold snap this winter.
Yep.
And Judy Wall turned off all of her systems, and it went down to 8 degrees during that 3-day minus 30. It didn't come up. 8 degrees was as low as it got.
It held the heat.
It held the heat. This is a warehouse with overhead doors.
Like how many square feet?
I have no idea.
They're over 150,000.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're
they're
big.
big.
150,000 square foot warehouse.
They're big.
They're big.
Well, they've built the warehouses to the zero carbon standard. So that's it's great that they did that testing too to prove that. But they had lots of challenges too. They had challenges to get into that pilot when it was first announced a few years ago because the warehouses wasn't an archetype that they were looking for in the pilot. So Judy and her team really had to fight to say we want to see if we can do this zero carbon warehouse, and they did it. And then the other disincentive that you see sometimes is so you've built a great building, it's more valuable, it's than other warehouses as an asset, but then it gets taxed higher because it's a more valuable asset. So we've got these disincentives there. So we need to, I think, find the carrots and find the levers that are going to support the leaders. And if the leaders do a little better from it, and than some of the laggers, let them do a little better financially from it. Let them benefit from it, so that others can learn from their example. And then
so is it safe to say like code and enforcement is not working so well, and incentive is maybe a better answer?
No. I don't think. I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah,
like I think you need to celebrate and incentivize the leaders, but we also just need better codes faster.
Mm-hmm.
We need to accelerate the adoption of the codes. So the provinces adopt the code after the federal code comes out, and we're how far are we now, Keith, from the 2020 code? Well, it's 2023,
It's
but
supposed to be 18 months from issue, right? And we're past that.
We're past that. So, and we know that the net zero energy code is 2030. Nova Scotia said we'll adopt it by 2032, but are we going to be able to meet those kind of targets? And some provinces haven't adopted the federal code at all.
Right.
They just operate.
And let's acknowledge that a code is the minimum legal requirement to build to. So when you said an energy code, this is the least you can possibly do. So we should be building above code constantly. And going back to one of your comments about recognizing the leaders, like one of Peter's buildings, Q Lofts, I was speaking to one of the condo owners there. He loves it. He said, my condo fees are rock bottom compared to any other condos around. But if you're just looking at the ticket price, you're probably going to pay more for Peter's condo than you are for the one that's down the street. But you got to go that level deeper. And I'm going to be one that's looking at labels and asking for energy bills, but not everybody is.
Right. Yeah.
You hit a sore spot in talking about codes and timelines on getting to 2030. When the 2020 code went out for public consultation, it had mandatory blower door testing in it.
And then it gets pushed back.
It gets pushed back from advocacy
People who don't
groups.
want to do that.
And so then the provinces and the territories go push back on the feds, and they pull that requirement out. So Engineers Canada, there's an article that I have here that they state, we've already missed 2030 because of that change.
Yeah.
If it's number 2 on the list of 5 steps to net zero, and you've taken the requirement out, well, which do you want? Do you want us to get to net zero, or do you want to satisfy a buoyant economy?
Well, that's where you get this challenge between the leadership and like who's going to lead, and I do stakeholder engagement for a living, so not to crap on stakeholder engagement, but it's a requirement of all of this policy development is stakeholder engagement. You have to listen to what people are saying. You have to take their views into account. And it goes back to not everybody being on the same page, not everybody understanding what net zero means, not everybody having that baseline sustainability or commitment to climate challenge, that you're going to have stakeholders, lots of them, who just say, you're all, the sky's falling, tree huggers.
Yeah.
Right?
Even in the best path, I mean, it is a clunky system to try to navigate through. For us to say, let's start changing this, we're talking about years in the process. Yeah. An example would be, I'm aware of some, let's say, lacking requirements in the 2017 Energy Code that have allowed some inefficient building to be built. Those same requirements are built into the 2020 code, which we don't even adopt yet. So that means we're not going to get beyond this until, at best, our next energy code, which is 2025, which we'll adopt in 2027. Yeah. So we're already 4 years behind, some known issues.
And those buildings are going to be around for 75 years, and they're going to need a total retrofit in 30 years.
Yes. Now you mentioned life cycle earlier for the government, for public tenders, for a school, let's say. What's considered the life cycle? How many years? When we're talking about planning and the operating costs that are much higher than the building costs. They're going to call it 25 years, but really it's 75, or what's the?
So most of the, I think, if you look at the zero carbon standard, I believe it's a 60-year horizon is what's used. That's kind of the agreed upon. We're going to look at it from A to Z, cradle to gate, cradle to grave. Yeah, it's a 60-year horizon. It's kind of what
I know when you're looking at assessing the materials that go into it, you're looking at a 60 years replacement, refurbishment, whatever. So that's one of them.
Keith and I are working on some long-term care facilities now, and when we talk on those, they value the life cycle as 25 years because that's the length of the mortgage, and we're doing our utmost best to convince them that it's 60 years or 100 years. Some of these nursing homes we're replacing are 100 years old. Yeah. So it stands to reason that it's 60.
Right, so just another layer that's not defined.
Yeah.
And what we bake in now, to use Will's term, I know you say that all the time, we're baking in the inefficiency, and it's going to be there for a really, really long time.
Halifax and Moncton are the fastest growing cities in Canada. I was about to say Atlantic Canada because I surprised myself, but in Canada, right now, the fastest 2 cities. Yeah. So I think the leadership has to say, if we're the fastest growing and this is our stock for the future, we can't pass up on this opportunity. We're missing it now.
Keith, I wanted to ask you about, I think we've talked about a lot of different things, code and enforcement, talked about, incentive, public, private finance groups, subcontractors, kind of where everybody fits in. But another layer would be the consultants, and to understand that to make this massive shift, this transition over time, one of the big deals for major architecture firms, I think, Will, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but also for mechanical engineering firms, is changing their standard library of details, where you've been using this tried, true, proven, details and assemblies for however many years, and that's a big deal for large firms. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I think it's safe to say that we're still on a learning curve about how building envelopes actually perform. we talk about an R23 wall and we can say that we do this and this and this, or we're failing to take into account some of the thermal bridges at the floor connections, wall connections, the foundations, you know, structural stuff that pokes through it, the things around the windows themselves. So when we think it's an R23 wall, it actually might be an R12 wall. So there's I think a growing understanding of that, and there's some really good information. So the BC Hydrothermal Bridging Guide is a great resource, and that actually kind of proves that out. That, you know, you can start with a wall that's R23, but by the time you poke all these things through it, it is much less than that. So codes kind of need to acknowledge that, and the design industry needs to acknowledge that. But there's some really straightforward stuff too that I think is partly that case, that we've just got this stock of details. We just put on, we're putting on a continuous, whatever, mineral fiber insulation, but we're putting on these continuous horizontal or vertical girts, not knowing that when we do that, it reduces that insulation value by 50%.
Right.
But if we do this instead, we only reduce it by 10%. So there's a lot of, I think, still learning that can go on in the design professions on how building envelopes actually perform.
I was just thinking to myself, once you update the details, then the next step is to get the trades to go, we don't need that.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter if you update it anyway, because they're just going to say, oh, well.
This is how we always do
how we
it.
do
This is how we've always done it. We don't need that.
That's so true.
Right.
I'd be the guy saying that.
I can save you $50 by doing this.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sure.
Not to, you know, put anybody down, but that's the tradition.
I know,
It's
yeah.
the tradition of, I haven't seen that before. That must be extra. Must be for another job.
Yeah, it's hard to break tradition.
It's
man.
hard to break tradition.
And that's really maybe one of the underlying currents and problem to this whole solution, to the solution, isn't it? Because you're really, it's a major shift from tradition.
It's huge.
So we're trying to invest in that capacity, right? In training, in retraining, and micro-credentialing, so that people are learning this stuff and they're getting some sort of badge or passport or something that they've gone through some training, like a green seal potentially, you know, instead of a red seal, that we understand this kind of stuff. So there is some investment in that part of the capacity building piece of how do we train people. And Will and I are working on a project on this, and it's complex, because it's not like build a course and put it in NSCC and we're done, right? It's like, how do you integrate it into what NSCC is doing? How do you integrate it into what Dal's doing with the design professionals? How do you get Bob with his hammer to
care about it,
it, let alone get online and do an online course from Pugwash? You know, like it's when you're talking about everybody being on the same page, the complexity of creating the training, creating the modes of delivery of that training, and reaching everybody is huge.
You've covered kind of the last half of the design construction part of it, but the first half is really important too. And we're still stuck in a mode of, right now, as an architect, my contract says I'm allowed 10% of my fee goes to schematic design and 15% goes to design development. Well, no, if I want to design this properly, I want to hire Will during schematic design to do this and this and this iteration. So my schematic design fee should probably be 20%, not 10%. So we've kind of got this built-in structure that's been in place forever that we need to kind of think about how to redo that.
Right, to build in the incentive.
And that's just in the architects. You know, the engineers probably have something like every silo in this ecosystem has a way that they do things that needs to change somehow, you know, or needs to adapt, or needs to, and so that's why it's just so big. It's so complex.
Is green seal a conceptual thing in your mind, or is it a real discussion?
No, well, it's a very discussion, but it's kind of conceptual.
Very interesting.
It's still nobody's officially doing it yet, and there's a lot of ownership around red seal, obviously, right? So we can't just go in with our good ideas and say you ought to be doing this, but there is conversation about it. Yeah.
We've touched on air tightness quite a bit in building envelope. Some renewables. Will, can you speak to a little bit about mechanical systems and how that part plays such a big role in this as well, right?
Definitely. I mean,
the materials, the spec,
the materials and the spec are one thing, but ultimately, you know, if you, again, let's just beat the hell out, I guess, the business as usual case, right? Client engages architect. Architect hands you the box and goes, fit it up, make it hot, make it cold.
Yeah.
Here's your budget, right? And here's your 10 by 10 mechanical room. So when you look at the component of that, we're really talking about second layer, right? We've gotten the waste out. If the architect's done a good job, looked at orientation, we've looked at breaking the envelope, we're airtight, and now we're saying, okay, how do we condition the space, right? And so you have a couple of plays there in the sense that engineers are no different than architects. They've got a library. Boilers are easy. You know, the doubling of the size of a boiler isn't typically double the cost. The doubling of the size of an air-to-water heat pump or a VRV air-to-air heat pump definitely is doubling the cost, if not tripling the cost, right? So that idea of the first layer being so critical in driving down what my mechanical system actually has to do is pretty key. You know, in terms of the strategy from the mechanical side, it's really been about we electrify and decarbonize, right? That's the magic left and right, you know,
Right.
Mr. Miyagi training you on the fence. But the reality is that that's totally dependent on where you are regionally in the country, right? So to electrify in Nova Scotia, no problem, we can do it. You know, heat pumps are going to save you some energy, it's some operating costs. But then you're going, well, what's my grid intensity, right? So we talk about net zero and we talk about energy and we talk about all these, and at the end of the day, they're all carbon, right? We're all really talking about carbon. What's my budget? What's my balance? Mm-hmm. So if we move all these stuff and we go high performance, we've got a good envelope, that's great. And we let Nova Scotia Power continue to kind of clean the grid, as you say. If I took that same building and dropped it in, say, Quebec, guess what? Their emission factor per kilowatt hour generated is almost zero because it's hydro, right? So when we look at these, how do we make the biggest cut, bang for buck carbon reduction? The play is, yeah, electrify, clean the grid, you know, and then we don't need as many solar panels in theory, right? But when you say electrify everything, guess what? We're dealing with old, you know, hasn't been upgraded in a long time, distribution, transmission equipment. So now we're adding loads to the electrical grid, and now Murray's got an electric car, an electric truck, and so we're doubling down on this, and we're going, okay, you know, electrical grid is just like a pipe system, right? It can only move so much water or electrons through it. So if everybody tomorrow turned off the fossil fuel tap and came on electrically, we're probably gonna be sitting in a brownout for a while, right? So it's that idea of going, we need capacity, we need to be able to start to, and again, this is where the layers get more complex because now we need, you know, interconnection of provinces. We need energy corridors where we can say, okay, I can wheel 10 more megawatts or gigawatts from Quebec into, or I have a bunch of excess on my solar farm or my wind farm and I need to be able to shift it somewhere else, right? Otherwise, what are we doing? Well, we'll buy batteries. Guess what? If I can't spend extra money on insulation, I'm probably not gonna have a building size battery in my budget, right? So it gets complicated quickly. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. Best practice currently, and what we've kind of pushed and promote is to go look at distribution. So even if today your budget doesn't allow VRV or geothermal or an air to water, make sure the distribution is low temp, right? So now I can take it off that boiler, I can put in a technology that doesn't need to be operating at 180 Fahrenheit, all right? It's that idea of going, if you look at all these old buildings, the challenge is I can't take some of these low temp systems into those buildings because guess what? The baseboards want high temp, right? They're sized to receive flow at this rate and at this temperature. And if you're giving me half the temperature, guess what? There's not enough heat, right? Mm-hmm. So now you're going, well, do I strip out all the baseboards and put in new distribution so now it can work? So again, it's got a couple of layers, but engineers are just as guilty as architects in the sense of we rely heavily on what we have in the bucket and what's on, you know, in the folders to go, I make money because I'm using something that I already know, right? And that's a challenge, right? You can talk about fees, you can talk about this and that, but at the end of the day, to do some stuff that's innovative, you need a client who's interested and who's not looking for perfect, because you know in some of those cases there's no such thing as perfect, and you need to have someone who's willing to go, we know there's going to be extra effort. You know, for me to pull out a set of plans that have a boiler with some baseboard rad and a central air source, you know, ventilation system or makeup air unit, pretty straightforward. But if I have to go through and figure out all this and work around fire protection and work around, you know, bulkheads, etc.
You also need a client that's willing to take the risk.
Yeah, convince the client.
And also willing to let their team members fail.
Right.
Like, we're going to try this.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. We're going to try it.
But
Let's
it's a
go for
big
it.
asset to have that risk for, right? I mean, you've had it. Clients who say, yeah, we want to do it, we want to do it. And then, oh, well,
And there's not a lot of them out there, right?
yeah, let's take this out and let's take that out.
Right.
And,
I would say, if you look at who's in the mainstream, and I'll use, multi-unit as a sector, like Dexel does it well. Dexel's got a bit of interconnection. They understand, they do some of that architect inside. So they're building with the intent of, I'm designing to make my build easier, right? And they go through system iterations. They go, okay, we've tuned that enough. We lock that in, and what's next, right? So it's that idea, we can't do it all at once. So how do we do it incrementally? So little things like, I would say, Keith's part is more important. My system can go into any building if Keith has designed it to be low thermal need and he's got low temp distribution. After that, we can retrofit all day. But if I have to take Keith's building and say, well, let's take all this cladding off, we're going to throw it in the garbage, we're going to put on the insulation. Guess what? I hate using 2-inch nails. I just don't, I'm never going to get my head around it from a fastener perspective, or I don't know what that detail is, so I'm going to skip the isolator on the girts. We're just blowing other people's money in the future, if that makes sense.
By the way, we've done a few projects with Will, and most of our projects are kind of double the energy performance, double the thermal values of the walls.
Yep.
We're going for air tightness, educating contractors on what it means to be airtight, and show them where the air barrier is and to leave that alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we've got a client yet that said, damn, I wish I didn't put so much insulation in.
That's it. That's it. And I think maybe that's a good point. And when we talk about this idea of education, and again, not to blur the message, but when you think about something like the zero carbon standard, which is the CAGBC's self-made standard for Canada, they brought in a new metric which is called TEDI, Thermal Energy Demand Intensity or Index, right?
TEDI.
TEDI, right? And the TEDI is really about going, based on all my losses, all my passive gains, and then what comes in and out of my ventilation, that's a thermal number that I can target. And if I can drive that number down, that's a measure of how resilient this thing is going to be. And
there's that word again.
There it is, resilient, right? Yeah, we're throwing it in there. But to go to Murray's point, they did a test in Toronto using low TEDI buildings, and they went a little further. They ran that test for up to 2 weeks. And they go, okay, what happens when I do a code building? After an hour, here's the temperature drop, 2.5, 3 degrees. After a day, here's the temperature drop. After a week, guess what? We're below freezing. They did the same with a low TEDI building, and guess what? At the end of 2 weeks, they were still in t-shirt and short weather, right? So that idea of, what happens when, I don't know, Texas has a freak snowstorm and everything freezes. Again, total cost of ownership, somebody paid billions of dollars in insurance money to repair all those when we should have been thinking about, maybe it's not going to happen today, but why wouldn't we put the money into it up front? Because at some point, it's just going to be someone else's dollar.
That's one notion of what resilient means is what do we do in a catastrophe? And there's a term called passive survivability coined by Alex Wilson in the States. It was after Hurricane Katrina. He kind of toured the area just still while there were power outages, and he noticed that all of the old houses still had people living in them. It's because they were designed to not require air conditioning, had high ceilings, they had ceiling fans, they had big verandas, so people were still able to live in that without power for weeks. So he's kind of building that into the notion of design. Like, what happens to this building if I don't have utilities for a certain period of time?
It makes me think of other drivers, like the insurance industry as a driver for change, or the financial sector as a driver for change. So, we know that ESG is getting some traction, some environmental, social, and governance goals, and it's a risk mitigation tool from a financial standpoint, from an insurance standpoint. And so you've got all of these sort of auxiliary players around the building sector that are driving some of this change. So, if you're a building owner and you have investors, they're going to want to know what your ESG plan is for your portfolio. And so if you're having to state it and report to it, you better be doing it, right? So that's driving some of the environmental considerations that we're seeing in the building sector. And same thing, if your insurers are asking what your risk mitigation is, and you're a portfolio owner, you've got to be doing some of this stuff, whether it's retrofitting or building more resilient buildings from the get-go. So it's good to see that kind of stuff, and until you get all the crap that's saying we're not going to pay attention to ESG anymore, and it's not going to be something that we we're allowed to talk about in Florida or something.
Right. Politically hot.
You know,
hot button.
there's that kind of pushback that happens when there are tools to drive us forward. There's always going to be the drag.
Yeah.
You know, no, we don't want to do that. No. We don't want to change how we do things, and it's going to cost me money, and it's going to challenge my business, and you know, those bad things instead of the good things that come out of those drivers. And all, I think often, and you know, this makes me cry sometimes, but you know, all of the good work that happens, all of the really good, smart people that are working in this space and trying to make a difference and trying to lead us and to drive us and to incentivize us, and you know, it's that's just tremendous to me, you know, that kind of stuff happens. So anyway, that's my little
I got a couple
soapbox.
thoughts, and one's going to change the conversation a little. It's on the same topic, but with respect to resilience, I'm not going to complain about Nova Scotia Power. The men and women that climb those poles and get the power back on for us, there's going to be power outages. What I'm going to complain about, though, is my neighbors starting their generators. They're breaking the peace and the silence that I'm enjoying, right? But in these resilient buildings, I remember the first passive house I was taken into. It was minus 25. The
It was nice and
owners were in
toasty.
Florida. They had their heating system shut off, and that house was set to turn on at 7 degrees. It never turned on. Now, you're talking about buildings and how you design as a mechanical engineer. You're talking Part 3, commercial buildings, apartment buildings. What happens to the homeowner where you're not involved, right? There's no architect. There's a designer, maybe. Maybe there's a designer.
Designer.
Might be a catalog.
It might be something they've
Catalog.
seen on the internet,
Yep.
and they printed it. But then there's
Some developers try and pull that off too, you know.
but then there's the plumber, the electrician, and the ventilation guy. All show up. And somebody sizes the heating system.
Somebody guesses that sizing the heating system.
Well, they don't guess, I don't think. They make sure it's plenty big,
Plenty big. Yeah, that's fair enough. They oversize. Right.
consistently.
Yep.
Because what's the last call they want?
Yeah. I'm uncomfortable. You failed.
Yeah, they don't want that call. And so I don't know how wasteful that is.
I'd say it's highly wasteful, and I think it also puts maybe you didn't mean to go in this direction, but it
Oh, I
opens
did.
up the direction where you go, you know, how is it possible that, you know, understandably a Part 3 and a Part 9 building are drastically different beasts. But how can I get a permit for a Part 9 building with a set of elevations and a floor plan? But I need mechanical, I need electrical, I need plumbing, I need all these other pieces from a Part 3 before I'll even issue a permit. Do you know what I mean? So this idea of, and I think it circles back around to the education, is we really need to support these folks by going, here's the free tool. Here's the detail that we created, and we actually tested on site, and guess what? Feel free to
Works.
use it, right? It's tall walls are a good example. You know, they're not difficult. And if you stay between X and Y and the window opening's not bigger than Z, this would be a typical framing for a tall wall, right? We should be doing the same thing with assemblies, right? We should be putting those out there, making them available, and going, look, if you're going to be a poor designer, at least go to the library, you know what I mean, and borrow the book and go, you know, add these 3 sheets to every drawing.
Here are the
pack.
good designs. Yeah.
That's it, right? And
Draw
then it
from
takes
this
it out.
shelf, not that shelf.
Right. And then in that next layer, you have to go train those folks how to do that, right? So if you have a contractor who goes, I just don't get how I use 2.5-inch fasteners. You know, like, what part are we missing here? You know, is it how you build out that window to refit it? Is it, you know, where's the gap in that knowledge? Where's the resistance coming from? Or is it, you know, you just don't know how to price it, right? Because that's the other thing, is that we run businesses to make money. There's nothing wrong with making money out of a company. You employ people. But if I'm going to bid on something that I don't totally understand, I'm going to de-risk myself, right? I'm going to go, I wouldn't do that, and I'm going to do my very best to convince you otherwise, because I know I make money selling you the peanut butter sandwich,
And
right?
coming back to Marie's point, I think our tradition of oversizing stuff isn't limited to people taking a guess at an undesigned, non-professionally designed home. I've seen examples in the commercial industry where engineer needs to size a domestic hot water tank for a multi-unit building, and they go through the calculations. Calculations say it should be 800 liters But ASHRAE said you should upsize that by 30%, which they round up to 1,500 meters. So we've almost doubled this thing just because of some perceived risk. I don't want to be the one that gets called when somebody's shower is lukewarm.
Yep.
So, so there's some of this silliness that goes on.
You talk about political will and aligning the will of aligning with
I was thinking about
political
that
will.
over the past few weeks, and
yeah, we talked about
or
that
the
before.
past week, I guess, since we've talked. And
I think you'd mentioned it. You see that being a
Doctor-
big part of the
Dr. Strang, he made the Atlantic bubble. And it was the Atlantic bubble that's drawn us to people moving here and people wanting to immigrate here. What is going to make people continue to want to come to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Atlantic Canada? Is it better buildings? Is it, leaders that say, you're going to be more comfortable? What is the role of government? Is it to protect the consumer? I think it is. I think it's their role to protect the consumer, and not from the developer. Like, don't get us wrong. We're not being hard on developers. They have a business to operate.
They have to make money.
That's
fair.
But maybe from themselves. Because, like I said, I'm not down feeling the draft. I'm not looking at your mechanical system. It's not something I show my friends.
yeah.
Right? If it's the targets that government are setting for us to make as a whole, as a group, as a society, well, they have to put the rules in place so that we do actually change. Will it make it for a better place to live? Why were people investing and going to BC for the past number of years? BC was probably the fastest growing. I don't know, but it was very quickly growing before this. Is it a sustainable approach to living?
Right.
Is that what people actually want? I think there's a fair movement towards that. I think there's a really big movement because
There's enough incentive for developers right there.
my own children, they're in elementary and middle school, actually in high school, one of them now. And
The forgotten one.
yeah, and they come home saying things like, Dad, I don't think I'm going to have children. And you get a little disappointed maybe at first, but you go, well, why? Well, we have too many people on the planet. And that's your reason for not having children? Okay, that's interesting. So they're being taught at a younger and younger age that there's a crisis. And so they're our future. We have to start changing. And so it's going to come, these ideas that you're talking about. I found that amazing, talking about a green seal or that
You like
idea,
that?
that notion. I really like that. But our kids are going to force it on us if we don't do it.
Right. And I think that's, a lot of the work that I do, again, is bringing people together so we can talk about these kind of
Yes.
things and we can come up with these ideas and finding ways to convene and learn from each other.
Safe to say you're in on a lot of conversations that a lot of other people wouldn't be.
I guess
handy
so.
to,
And
you know.
that's, we all live in
Unique
silos,
perspective.
right? So
Yeah.
you kind of, that's just my silo, I suppose. But what I try to do, and like BuildGreen Atlantic is a good example, is to say, okay, whose story needs to be told here? What do we need to learn about? Who do we need to profile? And what best practices can we share? And who do we put up in front of folks? So that's kind of part of curating that day of information for people. And I think it's going to be total information overload because it's, you try and cram it in, but there's lots of good stuff happening. Like when we put out a call for presentations, we had over 35 submissions for 15 presentation spots. And they were great. Like they were really great, good things that are happening that people say, hey, I want, like from, I don't know, some crazy boiler or something, that I don't know anything about, but I can go, who cares about boilers? And then you put it in front of the committee and they're like, oh, I care about boilers. I want to know about boilers, so it's like, I don't care about boilers, but anyway, I think it's just going to be information overload, but we need to find more opportunities for those kind of things to happen and to bring everybody together, because the architects talk to each other, the engineers talk to each other, the plumbers talk to each other, the building owners talk to each other, and we have these silos and we have these organizations that represent those groups, and we need more integration, I think, between the groups more often.
Yeah, we haven't touched a whole lot so far on the manufacturing side and building materials. I know I was speaking with someone the other day, the SMU campus, there's a new product being used on the south wall of Loyola building, solar cladding.
Yeah.
Heard a lot of new kind of retail agent reps here repping renewable products, whether it's EV chargers or renewable showers where the water's being recycled. Can we talk a little bit about that side, building materials and what you see kind of happening there? I don't mean just renewables, I mean all kinds of products. And we've mentioned insulation already, but cladding, new.
I would say let's let Keith take a run at that.
Yeah, I was thinking
Well,
the exact same thing.
And I think you should take a run at it.
Yeah,
But I
we have a
think
principle of an architect.
I think what it speaks to.
I should have been looking at him.
I think what it speaks to is that there are business opportunities. People see business opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So whether every solution is the right
Well,
solution,
they've got to be following that shift as well, right? 'Cause
right?
if all of a
That's
sudden
right.
your product's
So
not going to need.
that's the shift, is
Yeah.
following the shift and say, I see a business opportunity. I mean, Murray, you did it yourself, right? I
Yep.
see
Yeah.
a business opportunity here for this product, and finding ways to be, I think, part of the solution. And whenever even I'm sending stuff out to speakers for the conference saying, this is not a sales pitch, right? You have to frame it as a solution.
Yeah.
Like, how is this going to solve your problem? How is this product going to help solve that particular problem
Unless
that
you
you
want
have?
to go to the junk mail.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what
So
the sales
anyway,
pitches
Keith, I
go.
didn't mean to
Sure.
jump in there on it, but
In talking about materials, there are a couple of aspects to that. And one is, in the industry, we're starting to get used to talking about energy numbers. And one of them is the EUI, energy use intensity, of so many kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And when Will was talking about targets, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. How do we get this energy use down to a certain number of kilowatt hours per year?
Is
Whether
there
it's
a
100,
number you can use for
100,
context?
100. 100 is a pretty good number.
That's a good number.
60 is a better number.
Right.
200's meh. 400, and a lot of buildings are built with 400
Really?
kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So now that we're starting to bring that language in, there's another part that is starting to come into the discussion, and that's the embodied energy, or the embodied emissions associated with the building. And you can talk about it in a similar kind of thing, only we talk about it in carbon dioxide per square meter per year. So that's language that's people are now starting to be aware of. And the difference is, we talk about the embodied energy, which happens right up until the building's opened. And then there's the operational energy that starts. So we've got this huge impact that happens before we even have the first energy bill. The energy bill happens gradually over the next 50 years. And when we've got net zero buildings, the energy is going to be hopefully zero. So in that case, the entire impact is on this, we call it embodied carbon, the embodied impact of materials. So there's research happening now on how we model that. So we're starting to get into that now. And it turns out that the embodied impact of materials is worth, even at current sort of normal energy consumption, it's several years of equivalent of energy consumption. So that's the kind of thing that we should start entering into the discussion. And there's a lot of things that go into that. Concrete's being noted as a significant one. Steel's a significant one. Insulation, there's a wide variety in what the impact of different types of insulation is. So that should be part of the lingo that we're talking about. So that's one part, is just awareness of what this impact is. And then the other part is technology. So some of these, photovoltaic claddings, fantastic. It's, doing two things at once. It's keeping the water off and it's producing electricity at the same time. Or windows that produce electricity. Or new materials that sequester carbon right in them. So we can get greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, put it in the material, and it's locked in forever. So that's also, on the fringe of where we're starting to go, trying to get new products, new processes in place that minimize this growing awareness of the embodied impact.
Well, we have about 5-10 minutes before we need to kind of wrap things up here. I'm sure we could go on for hours, but maybe we'll give everyone a chance to kind of touch on anything we didn't talk about yet that you want to bring to the forefront, or maybe we can start with you, Will, if you like.
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Like, we talk about it, and we see what's going to fall out of the tea leaves or what's going to fall out of the cards. And the reality is we always need to be educating. We always need to be doing continual improvement process, right? So we know there's going to be, call it an A, B, and a C builder. We don't need to worry about trying to move the C's to the A's. We need to go, how do we leverage the A's, learn the lessons, and then share the lessons, right? So I think at the root of it, there's two pieces for me that seem to be really lacking. The education is one of them. It's this overarching vernacular. It's this idea of saying, we're all talking, and when I say this, you understand what I mean, and it's not, we're just being plain language. Do you know what I mean? I think architects, engineers, technical professionals live in the acronyms world, and it doesn't always trickle down to the homeowner, to use the classic example. I just want a house. I want it to be nice, and when my friends come over, I want them to be impressed, right? That has nothing to do with going inside. So I think there needs to be a massive push on educating. And, when we look at that specifically in and around the trades, we go, we don't necessarily have to create all these new trade designations. We need to incrementally trade the existing trades folks we have. And when you take those trades professionals, we go, I'm going to add skills to your belt, whether it's a black belt, whether it's like your Nova Scotia construction safety passport, right? You physically get your WMIS, you physically get your fall arrest. So, teaching a cladding gentleman or a woman how to properly detail a corner or a window, that makes a lot of sense. I think, on the political will and regulations, the government has to honestly step up and go, we've said we've committed to these things, Bill 57. It's not going to be super popular with some groups, but we're going to adopt the codes. Get out of the way. Do you know what I mean? Like, adopt it, put them in play. You've done your piece. We're not asking the government to solve how we get there, but this waffling doesn't make anybody.
Right.
It's that pause in the train. Do you know what I mean? And now we have to get the train back up to momentum. So I think straight education, living within the policy, and letting the experts share the lessons, we're going to go faster. Green Seal is a good example. It would be lovely to have. It's probably 12 years out. By the time the national talks to the provincial and the this. So we have to go beside that, here's 10 ways for Murray to upskill today that don't require him to leave a job and go take another 2-year degree. You know what I mean? So I think education, and then just the political will to actually enact the policies and regulations we've already got in place, and then get out of the way. I think that's where we're going to win.
Right, Murray?
We've covered a lot of ground, and I don't have a lot to say. I just have one final thought, which is, if we're trying to align the government's will to the broad consumer base, well, housing is going to get more expensive. That's a reality, be it single family, be it multi-residential. You can stymie it, it can slow down, but it's still continually going to go up. If I have some way to show that my house is worth more, it's more comfortable through a labeling program, you're going to attract people to your region. Full stop. Because my investment, it's going up. It's going to cost me more to get in. Mortgages are going to be longer. It's what it is. So we have to have a way for people to say, yep, I can recover this. And I can recover it easier.
Keith?
The IPCC just came out with a new report that's been several years in the making, and it sounds like it's pretty alarming. I haven't looked at it yet. I appreciated when they were presenting it, there was a little nod to the current move of the year, because they said, what do we need to do? And the answer was, we need to do everything everywhere all at once. So there, I think we need to acknowledge there is urgency, and even how we frame that and talk about that in our language. We used to talk about global warming, and people going, oh, that's great. Yeah, a little warmer climate would be nice. Now we're talking about climate change. What if we change that, talk about climate catastrophe, climate emergency? Because that's what we're seeing in the news almost every night. Climate change is causing these catastrophes all around the world. Or even simple things like natural gas. It's methane. So let's actually acknowledge, within our terminology, what we're doing, what our impact is, and start doing it now.
Lara?
Yeah, I think we need to keep talking and keep learning from each other and keep finding ways to do this kind of thing, so we're getting the word out. I mean, we all live in this space, but homeowners all live in their homes, and we all work in buildings, and like the impact of buildings on our lives is so huge, and we don't really think about that. We don't think about it in relation to this climate catastrophe. And we don't think about, the elements of the spaces that we're in that have an impact on that climate catastrophe. So let's keep
I like those words.
let's keep trying to get people to pay some attention to it.
Absolutely. Well, Will, Murray, Keith, Lara, thank you for joining us today. Great discussion on a very important topic. So hopefully we've shed some light. There's a lot of ground to cover. It's hard to squeeze into an hour and a half segment, but I think maybe we did okay.
Can I do one more plug?
Absolutely, of course.
So even though the conference is sold out, there still are some pre-conference workshops on March 29th. So if you want to learn about Passive House, and there's an introduction to Passive House. If you want to learn about CAGC, zero carbon, Will is teaching that course on Wednesday morning. In the afternoon, there's an ASHRAE workshop, and there's also a Green Building Initiative workshop. They run Green Globes, which is a rating system. So they're talking about Green Globes
Some
and
great
ESG.
workshops.
Yeah, some really good
relevant
workshops,
topics.
really affordable, and come and dive in for 3 hours on these topics.
We're excited to have a booth.
We're
Yeah.
excited
Excellent.
to have you
We're
there.
excited to have a
Keith
booth.
is on the panel for the lunchtime, after the lunchtime keynote. So the lunchtime keynote is the $2 trillion opportunity. So for the business people there.
So we're going to have to have the same discussion, but in about 10 minutes.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
Even
And
harder.
Keith's bringing sort of the local perspective, and Will be there. Will's teaching on Wednesday, as I said, and then we'll be in the audience on Thursday, and networking and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Awesome.
And you guys will be there
Absolutely.
shooting and talking. And
Excellent.
And hopefully
getting
some of,
clips
hopefully
and-
some of our listeners who are listening who maybe weren't aware of it. I'm sure most people are, but if it's the first time they're hearing about it, hopefully they'll come out and check it out too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
March 30th, next Thursday, BuildGreen Atlantic. Thanks again,
Awesome.
folks. This was great. Really appreciate your
Made
time.
it very
Great.
enjoyable.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
was
Yeah, it
fun.
was
Thank
fun.
you.
Quick shout out to the newest sponsor of the show, the Stone Depot. The Stone Depot is located in Bears Lake, Halifax, but serves all of the East Coast. The showroom over 8,000 square feet, perfect for masonry contractors, landscaping contractors, builders, developers. Regardless, the Stone Depot is a great option for you, whether you're doing fire pits, patio stones, kitchen and interior stones. So if you're looking for a great stone supplier, visit the Stone Depot.
This episode is brought to you by Cook Insurance, your trusted insurance broker in Atlantic Canada for 50 years. Insurance is complex, and the Cook team focuses on delivering comprehensive solutions for your construction needs, including builder's risk, wrap-up liability, performance bonds, and project-specific construction. A Navicord partner since 2020, Cook is one of the largest construction brokers in Canada and offers national strength with a local touch. Whatever your insurance needs are, Cook has you covered. We would like to take this time to thank a longtime sponsor of our media platform, FCA Surety. The brokers at FCA Surety are experts in all surety bonding categories and provide unparalleled service during the bonding process.